Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, June 11th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about a couple of traditions in college football that are getting a little bit messed up this upcoming year that I want to break down for you all. Then we're going to get into the transfer portal. It sounds like we are fully done with the transfer portal. There are a couple of stragglers still out there, but definitely a lot of the work has been done there, and I want to break down who actually won the portal compared to who you might have thought won the portal. Then we'll get into a little talk around the Big Ten. We'll get into win totals and Cinderellas just like we did yesterday. Before we finish it up with a Top 10 Tuesday, we'll break down the biggest domino players in college football, which essentially is just players that can affect much more than just their team or their conference. They can affect the entirety of college football. So I want to break that down today. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun interactive experience here, and that's always fun for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about these college football traditions that are a little bit under attack this upcoming year. There's definitely a lot of people that, it's a changing world in college football, and there's a lot of different things that are kind of going out the window in terms of tradition. There's some rivalries we're leaving behind with some different conference realignment stuff. There's some regionality we're leaving behind for sure. There's some different things that definitely make this sport special that are kind of things of the past at this point. But there are two things I want to narrow in on today that I think, at least in 2024, could be under a little bit of scrutiny and definitely are not what they are meant to be. And I want to start with one of the coolest traditions in all of college football, the whiteout. The whiteout is one of the coolest atmospheres that we have in college football. It's one of the coolest things that happens in college football on a yearly basis. It's absolutely remarkable. The fans are off the charts. It's just one of those atmospheres that, is on your bucket list. Absolutely one that I want to go to before, in my lifetime, absolutely, no doubt about it. But for Penn State, the whiteout is such a big deal, right? It's one of the best atmospheres. It's probably one of the biggest weekends in that city across the entire year, if I'm being totally honest. And in State College that day, it's always electric. The problem is the last couple of years, it hasn't quite been what it could be. After the COVID season where they didn't have a whiteout, obviously, they've played Auburn, Minnesota, and Iowa on their whiteout games. Obviously, that's because you got to play whiteout at night to make the atmosphere that much better. You got to play it at certain times of the day, and Ohio State, Michigan, those types of games have been taken by big noon kickoff for those kickoff times at, noon. So it doesn't necessarily help to have a whiteout in the, beginning of the day. They want to have it at night, and the Auburn game itself was actually pretty fun, to be totally honest with you, but it didn't necessarily have the same atmosphere because you want it to be a conference matchup. Frankly, if it's not Ohio State or Michigan, it's pointless. I think the whiteout has to be the one of those two games, and they have the privilege of having those games at home. One year it's Ohio State, one year it's Michigan. Making those night games does not seem like the hardest thing in the world to me. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe it's a lot harder than I'm thinking. But in all of these TV contracts, it feels like there's almost a laziness about it where we can't just get in a room and figure out, this is what the fans want, this is what pretty much everyone wants, find a way to put this game at night. You can still have big noon kickoff there, but the actual broadcast will be in Michigan against Oregon, which is actually the same weekend as Ohio State, Penn State, which is likely where you want this game. But as of right now, it looks like Illinois or UCLA could end up being the whiteout, which is obviously not exactly what they want up there in State College, and it's definitely something that kind of ruins this moment. The whiteout is one of the coolest, one of the best traditions that we have. It's one of the best, nights in college football that we get every single year, and I think leaving it on the table, leaving it to an Illinois or a UCLA, no disrespect to either of those teams, the fact is it should be a night game on national television against Ohio State or Michigan. That's just bar none, that's absolutely the way it should be. Maybe at some point Oregon gets up into that group, Nebraska maybe, who knows. But as of right this second, those two games are the games for Penn State. And not having a whiteout on one of them just feels a little ridiculous to me. But it's one of the most pure forms of college football that we have, and the idea that we can't have it, on one of the biggest games of the weekend and have it be Penn State, Ohio State as a whiteout and market everything around that is a little bit crazy to me, and it feels like it's just kind of happening more out of circumstance rather than actually needing it to happen. So it's one of those very frustrating things where it feels like a lot of the traditions that we've lost over the last couple of years are a little bit a sign of the times, right? It's kind of becoming a little bit more about money and making your athletic budget work and all of that different type of stuff. This is a very fixable problem. This is a very fixable thing that we can keep this tradition alive, keep it special to the fans, and it seems like people, the powers that be at least, are not willing to do that. So definitely a very frustrating thing, something that you hope you can get figured out for absolutely, because it should be Ohio State against Penn State at night with a whiteout in State College. So hopefully that happens. But the other one that I want to talk about is the Army-Navy game. There is a ton going on around this game right now. There is a lot of big things that happen around this game pretty much every single year. It's usually that standalone weekend, right? It's Army-Navy right after conference championships end. It's kind of that buffer in between regular season football and postseason football, or at least bowl games and the playoff. And I love it that way. I think having it on its own day is a very special thing, and I think especially if they're not going to be considered for a playoff consideration, they should absolutely have their own day. Well, that's not going to be the case this upcoming year. They will play the Celebration Bowl at 12 p.m. Eastern, and they will play the Camilla Bowl at 9 p.m. Eastern. Now, the Army-Navy game will happen at 3 p.m., so it doesn't necessarily affect it too much. I'm not necessarily, bemoaning this overly aggressively, and I'm not necessarily too mad about it, but it is kind of just one of those other traditions that feels like a very fixable problem. It feels like something that can absolutely be scheduled around. And on top of this, I think the Celebration Bowl should be standalone, and they shouldn't have people, going away from that to watch the Army-Navy game, because that's what they're going to do at 3 p.m. instead of finishing out that game, which is between the two HBCU schools. It's the only HBCU bowl game that we have. And the fact is, a lot of people are going to switch away from that game towards the end of it and watch the Army-Navy game as it, starts with all of the theatrics and everything. And I don't think that's necessarily fair to either of the games. So I think this is one of those where, frankly, it's likely not going to change too much of what that day is. But I just really like that day. I know it seems it might be a little bit childish, I'll be totally honest with you, but there is some of that energy that's college football. Having Army-Navy standalone on the day after conference championship games is something special, and it's something that is specific to college football, and brings a lot of college football fans together watching the exact same thing at the exact same time. And I think it's not necessarily that, the other two bowl games are ruining it by any means, or the other two bowl games should, do anything differently. It's just, I feel like this is a scheduling issue that absolutely could be handled. And I feel like it's somewhat of, for whatever reason, the powers that be, making these decisions and setting the schedule are not willing to just keep some of the things alone. Just leave them the way they are. It felt like it was happening with Texas OU, leaving possibly the State Fair in Dallas and moving over to Arlington to Jerry World. That was something that no Texas, no Oklahoma fan was ever on board for, but it was definitely getting talked about, and I'm sure it's still probably getting talked about in certain circles, although I don't think that's happening in the near future by any means. So it just feels like there are certain things that in this sport, especially in college football, where traditions mean so much and they're so important to all of the fans, that we got to be able to have certain things that are standalone, that have their own weekend like Army-Navy does, or that just have, that tradition behind them. And I think slowly but surely, a lot of stuff was taken from us all at once with some rivalries, with some regionality, with some of the, finer points of this game. And then they're slowly taking away all of the little, very specific special things. And the whiteout one, to me, is frankly the bigger one that I'm focused on, if I'm being totally honest. I think Army Navy is still going to be a very special event. I think when it stands alone, it's still going to be one of those things that, people are going to tune in, and that's not necessarily too much of an issue. I think it's still going to be a very special game. It's still going to be something that a lot of people watch, and I think it's going to be really, really cool. The whiteout is a thing that it is college football. It is as pure a form of college football as you will find across this country. It is as cool as it gets. It is one of the best atmospheres in the entire country across the last decade. So I think it's something that has to be fixed. I'm holding out a little bit of hope that they can figure it out and have that Penn State-Ohio State game be at night, be a whiteout game, and have everyone in State College just going absolutely crazy. But right now, it doesn't seem like it's going that way. So a very kind of frustrating turn of events, I think, with all of the things that are changing in college football, with all of the conference realignment and NIL and transfer portal and all of the stuff that we've had to get used to. I think some of this stuff is more important to us, and it's becoming more important as we get further and further down this road, because it shows what college football really is. The games like Georgia, Florida, the games like Texas OU being split down the middle at the 50-yard line, the Penn State whiteout, whatever it may be, the game up in Ann Arbor or in Columbus. Those are the special things about this game, and it feels like if we can't, just shuffle a couple of things around to make the whiteout what it should be, I don't know what we're doing. So it's a very frustrating turn of events. I think a lot of people, especially Penn State fans, are very, very frustrated with the whiteout. I'm sure there are people that are not too happy about the Army-Navy game, although I think they scheduled it in a way to where it can work. I just think it's a little bit frustrating that there is going to be the overlap of two games in particular, Army-Navy and the HBCU bowl game, that likely should have their own standalone spot. So that's kind of just a minor beef, I suppose, I have with the scheduling powers that be. But at the end of the day, traditions are a part of this sport, and I think the little ones are becoming that much more important, and we got to try to hold on to them as best we can. I know some of them are a little bit trivial, some of them are a little bit smaller than they seem, but at the end of the day, it is important. So we'll figure out, what's happening with the whiteout. Hopefully they figure that one out quickly, but we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about who actually won the transfer portal. There's a lot of talk around some big-time teams. They didn't necessarily end up on this ranking that CBS put out than I thought they would. So I want to break down it, go conference by conference, and break it all down for you guys right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different traditions in college football, including the whiteout and the Army-Navy game, and how they're going to be just a little bit different than they have been in past years, and definitely not what we want. But we'll hopefully figure out more about the whiteout. It seems like the Army-Navy one is set in stone at this point. But let's move on to the transfer portal, and let's talk about who really won the transfer portal. There's a lot of talk around the transfer portal around pretty much the entire year, let's be totally honest. But especially over the last couple of months, it's been absolutely crazy. It's been all over the place, tons of players going every which way, decommitting from teams they've committed to and going to a different school. It's all over the place, and it's really hard to keep track of, but CBS and Brandon Marcello did us all a huge favor, and they put together a little bit of a better way to understand who actually won the portal and who didn't, and it's by net rating gain, which is essentially just the average rating of the player that you lost compared to the average player of the rating that you brought in. So some teams are very positive. Obviously, the Power 4 teams, a large amount of them are going to be in the positive because they likely get guys from the group of 5 stages from different parts of the sport where they have a little bit more ability to bring in the top level guys. So I want to go conference by conference and give you a couple of ideas of who really won, who really lost. We're going to give the top 5 and the bottom 5 from every conference and give you guys an idea of maybe there's some ones that you didn't expect, maybe there's some ones that don't necessarily match up with what you thought, and they're definitely hard for me. So I want to start breaking this down for you guys, and I think the most interesting thing when we start with the ACC in particular, Florida State and NC State leading the way is not all that surprising to me. You know, they added new quarterbacks, they added a running back one, they added a big-time wide receiver at both those places. So you're obviously going to have, you know, a very good portal class when you're able to add those big-time positions, especially Florida State, where you didn't really lose, you know, too much in Tate Rodemaker from the transfer portal. Bringing in DJ is obviously going to be a win in that category. And then you have teams like Boston College, Georgia Tech, Syracuse, and I think some of that is just a testament to who they have at head coach. I think a lot of the fit between those 3 colleges is almost perfect with the 3 guys that they have there. Bill O'Brien obviously had the very interesting, you know, week saga at Ohio State as their offensive coordinator before making his way over to Boston College, and I think he's done a great job of just being the Boston College head coach. It feels like he fits perfectly there. It feels like that's where he's meant to be, and definitely going to be a huge asset for them going forward. So very, very interesting. I feel like he's been doing a really good job there. Brent Key at Georgia Tech is another guy to watch. I think he's one of the more underrated coaches in the entire country, if I'm being totally honest. He's building something down at Tech that feels like it's sustainable. It feels like it's not just going to be a flash in the pan program. They're going to play really good football pretty much every single week, and as long as, you know, they start to figure out that defense down there, it'll be fascinating to watch that team grow and grow throughout the years. And then you have Fran Brown down at Syracuse. He did absolute work in the portal, and they lost a ton of guys, but they brought in even more talented guys, including Kyle McCord was definitely the big coup of that transfer portal class. So a lot of really talented groups in this top 5 for the ACC. I think it's a lot of what you would expect, some of what you didn't expect, with Georgia Tech being in there, maybe Syracuse being in there, Boston College maybe shocked you, but the bottom 5 is really where the story is, in my opinion. I think Pittsburgh and Duke are not all that surprising. I'm a little surprised they're on the negative side, particularly Duke, with adding someone like Malik Murphy and doing some of the things they did, but when you lose someone like Jordan Waters at running back, it's going to be hard to replace that type of talent. So it's not necessarily the craziest thing in the world, not necessarily too wild one way or the other, but those 2 teams at the bottom isn't crazy surprising to me. Neither is Stanford by any means. I think they're never necessarily going to be big-time power players in the transfer portal. They could be, you know, solid and fill gaps where they need to, but they're never going to be up there with the Florida States, the North Carolinas, the NC States of the world likely. But then Miami and Virginia Tech are the 2 that I really want to zero in on. Miami is very interesting because when you look at the transfer portal classes, they added some big-time players, and it felt like they had a lot rolling down there. Maybe not as much as we might think. They definitely lost some big-time guys as well. So it seemed to be, you know, a huge big-time class for Miami, and I still think they got some really big-time players for them, but they lost some guys as well. And then Virginia Tech feels like it's a little bit more circumstantial than Miami. It feels like it's some of just, you know, a lot of guys came back and they absolutely like the group that they have. So they're not necessarily going to be towards the top of this list. They did bring in a couple of really good guys, but they don't necessarily need to do a lot of work. And then Clemson wasn't included in this because they lost 12 guys. They added 0. So not a ton to break down there. But the Big Ten is a very interesting group as well. Ohio State and Purdue's numbers are insane. They are far above pretty much everyone else in the Power 5. In fact, Nebraska, I think, is number 4. So the Big Ten did absolute work in the portal. Ohio State is very obvious. Caleb Downs, Seth McLaughlin, Quinshon Judkins. When you add those guys, it's going to be incredible. I mean, they had 25 guys leave, only 7 come in, and that's how well they did. So it's just incredible what they were able to do in the portal. Purdue doing incredible things, even losing guys like Nick Scourton and Deion Burks, adding guys like Nyland Green, Denylon Morissette, CJ Smith from UGA. All of those guys are hugely important. So I think Ryan Walters is starting to do what he's going to have to do up there in West Lafayette to win some football games. And then you get to Nebraska, Iowa. Definitely Nebraska had a very good class. Isaiah Nayer, Jamal Banks, Dante Dowdle, a ton of really, really big players for them. And then Iowa, it's really just, giving Tim Lester more offensive talent to work with. And then Oregon, we all know, did an awesome job, brought in some really big-time players there. Michigan losing some guys like Keon Saab, Jeremiah Beasley definitely did not help them be on the wrong side of this list right here. On the negative side, actually, for this portal class. Not necessarily overly surprising, but definitely something that Michigan is going to have to, be a little bit worried about. I think Indiana being on the wrong side of this is a little bit surprising to me. They did lose some big-time players like Kobe Minor, but at the end of the day, brought in a ton of big-time players as well. C.J. West from Kent State, brought in a ton of JMU guys, obviously with Kurt Signetti coming over. So there's a ton to like about that team. UCLA is going to have to be a bigger factor in the portal going forward if they really want to be a big player in the Big Ten. So a ton to break down in the Big Ten. The two really setting the pace here are Ohio State and Purdue, and it's by a comfortable margin. Let's just put it that way. But let's move over to the Big 12, and BYU leading the way here at 3.16. Definitely a little bit surprising. Utah, I think, did great work. They're number 2 in this conference and brought in guys like Dorian Singer, Tayshawn Lyons. So did great job of adding some guys. BYU adding Jerry Bohannon, who is likely their starter at quarterback, definitely helped this a ton and likely didn't lose a ton of guys if you're BYU. So very helpful for them. Kansas and Kansas State continue to build out that Big 12 contender teams. They are top 5 in this as well. So Kansas State bringing in guys like Dylan Edwards was the big-time win. And then Kansas' big-time win was by Jobe, the edge rusher from Michigan State. So a lot of really, really good work there. Cincinnati being in the top 10 is huge for them. Brendan Sorsby coming in is absolutely huge. Definitely will be their starter at quarterback. So Scott Satterfield is doing exactly what he has to do at Cincinnati if he wants to be a player in the Big 12. And then you go to the wrong side of this list and you have Arizona being in the positive is actually wild. Losing the number of players that they did, still being able to be on the right side of this is very helpful. Obviously in the lower side of the conference, but when you lose a coach like Jed Fish, you're likely going to be. But it's really more important the guys that didn't enter for them. Noah Fafita, Tatori McMillan, the guys that really are the engine for this team not going in is the biggest win. And then you have Arizona State, likely needs to be bigger players in the portal going forward if they want to be big-time players. Same thing with Houston, definitely kind of a UCLA type situation there. TCU and Iowa State being at the bottom is a little bit just, they return a lot of guys. TCU not quite as much. Iowa State is just, they're comfortable where they're at. I'll be totally honest with you. And it's just kind of TCU, that's the game they play. They're going to lose a lot of guys. They're going to gain a lot of guys every single year. They came out a little bit on the negative side this year, but definitely still a ton of really good players they brought in. And then finally, let's move to the SEC, and it's Texas leading the way here. I don't think that's too much of a surprise. Adding the wide receiver D-line talent that they did is obviously going to help this out a ton. So adding guys like Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden is absolutely a huge part of this. Missouri number 2, bringing in Caden Green is one of the biggest pickups of the entire portal cycle. So that totally makes sense to me. You also have Tennessee and Ole Miss at 3 and 4. Both these teams did a great job of assessing weaknesses and addressing those in big ways. I think Tennessee did a great job of addressing the defense and the offensive line with Lance Hurd coming in. I think Ole Miss did a great job of addressing pretty much the entirety of that defense this offseason. So obviously a great class for them. And then Georgia bringing in guys like Colby Young, London Humphreys, Xavier McLeod was all good enough to get them number 5 in the conference. And then you go to the bottom 5, and the absolute bottom is Bama. And I think that was likely going to happen. This was going to be a really, really tough portal cycle for them with Saban leaving. They lost 40 guys. They only brought in 15. So it was going to be an uphill battle. There's no two ways about that. Oklahoma and A&M being on this side of this is not necessarily ideal. They did kind of have an up and down cycle where you lost some big-time players. You brought in some big-time players. So kind of a, even loss there for Oklahoma and A&M, just a little bit in the positive direction. And then you have Mississippi State and Vandy towards the bottom here as well. That's likely where they're going to be in the SEC for quite some time. No disrespect to either of those schools, but you're really fighting an uphill battle now if you weren't before. So it's very interesting to look at these. I think a lot of times when you look at the transfer portal, you only look at the guys that are coming in, right? You only look at the big-time names that are going to Miami or Ohio State or wherever. But sometimes it doesn't necessarily even out with the players that are walking out of your program. So I think it's a really, really interesting thing to look at. Definitely something that will give us an idea of who actually won, who actually lost. As you probably already knew, Ohio State really won, along with Texas, along with Purdue, did a great job. So a ton of really good teams that definitely did a ton of work in the portal. So it'll be fascinating to watch that develop. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to start our little breakdown we've been doing the last couple of days, where we're going to do win totals for the Big Ten, and then we're going to do Cinderellas for the Big Ten. We did this yesterday with the SEC, if you want to go check that out, but definitely the Big Ten is just as interesting, if not more so. So I want to break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the transfer portal news and some of the stuff that doesn't really get talked about too much. You always see the players coming into programs, don't always compare them to the players that are walking out. So it's a little bit tough to contextualize. CBS did a huge favor for us by contextualizing it a little bit better. So that was really fun to break down. But let's get to the Big Ten and let's talk about win totals, who's too high, who's too low, who is just right, who's absolutely on the money. But it starts obviously with the two teams up top, and those are the two teams that everyone's talking about around this time, around the Big Ten. It's Ohio State and it's Oregon. Much like Texas and UGA in the SEC, they're kind of setting the pace for everyone else in the conference. I think Ohio State is likely has their nose just a little bit out in front, but when you look at these two schedules, it's going to be really two teams that likely will go 11-1, maybe even 12-0. It really will decide who wins that game, and Eugene might just decide who goes undefeated, who goes 11-1, if I'm being totally honest. But these are the two teams definitely setting the pace in this conference, and they're followed pretty closely up by Penn State and Michigan at 9.5 wins. So I think both these teams are going to be really good. They don't want to be below Ohio State, I can almost promise you that, but they absolutely have the potential to, win that game when they do get a shot at them, because both these teams absolutely do. So we'll figure that out. We'll figure out who actually deserves to be above who, and how Penn State matches up, how Michigan matches up. But I think both these teams have undefeated potential. I think both these teams have 8-4 potential. So it's kind of an interesting situation there. I think they're right where they should be, but it's going to be an interesting season for both these teams, definitely. And then you get to the 7.5 teams, no 8.5 win totals, which is very interesting for this conference. But the 7.5, the 7.5 is likely where this is going to be decided. A lot of the conferences, you'll find there are a couple of teams in kind of the middle of the pack. The teams that aren't necessarily good enough to win a conference title, which I would technically think a lot of these teams, Washington, USC, Nebraska, Iowa, I think they all likely will not win the Big Ten this upcoming year. But I do think they will have plenty to say with the guys that have a chance to win the Big Ten, where they're going to play some of the games against Michigan, Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State, and all of these teams can compete with those teams. So there's going to be an upset or two in this group, and there's going to be a couple of teams in this group that might just really mess it up for other people and live above their potential. There might be a couple of teams that, go a little bit under what they are capable of doing. So it'll be fascinating to watch those teams. I think those are likely the teams that we'll look back on and say they decided the Big Ten in a lot of different ways. And then you get to the 6.5 teams. You have Maryland, Wisconsin, Rutgers. Rutgers is doing a lot of really good things. I think they're starting to move up in this world and starting to kind of become a better program in the Big Ten. Greg Schiano's done a great job over there in the last couple of years. Wisconsin, I really like, if I'm being totally honest. They're all kind of fighting an uphill battle with some of the talent gap that they're dealing with, but I think this is a really fun group of teams, and I think they have the ability to make some noise, maybe, spring an upset here and there and totally mess up someone's season from time to time. And then you get to the 5.5 teams. You have Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Northwestern, and UCLA. All of these teams will likely have not a lot to say about the conference, but there's always that one, right? There's always that one team that, one game that they play just out of their minds. It's like the Purdue game against Ohio State in 2018, where it doesn't make a lot of sense. You don't really know how it happened or why it happened, but they won that game. And I feel like this group is definitely one of those that can do that. I think Indiana's a really fun one to watch with a lot of guys coming over from JMU. I think Northwestern is fascinating to watch with David Braun going into his second full-time year as the head coach over there. So it'll be fascinating to watch what happens there. And then the 4.5 teams are Michigan State and Penn State, the teams that you're not going to hear much from them. I'll be totally honest. For some reason it says 2.5 there. The number is 4.5. I apologize for that. But both these teams are fighting a really, really hard battle this year, and it's going to be kind of a slow build under the two coaches there right now, Ryan Walters at Purdue and Jonathan Smith at Michigan State, but I think they're going to be okay programs. I just think it's going to take some time to get there, and 2024 is not going to be that year. Let's just put it that way. But let's get to who I think is too high, too low, and right on the money. And let's start with too high. And I think Washington's just a little bit too high. I'm fully prepared to be wrong about this team. I think that it's very possible that I will be. I was probably wrong when I was talking about Arizona this time last year. But I don't think this team has a Noah Fifita on it. I just don't know if, they have the quarterback talent that they need to really compete in this conference and to even win 7, or I think they could win 6 games. I think that's likely where they'll probably end up. Maybe I'm being a little bit low on the Huskies, and I'm sure Jed Fish will let me know that if I am. But at the end of the day, I just don't necessarily love this team as much as some other people might. And then Maryland, losing Tualia and Jayshon Barham, you're at 6.5 for a win total, so you could definitely still get there. Mike Locksley is still going to make games interesting, but I just don't know if they have that big-time player that they need on both sides of the ball to really compete with some of these teams. So don't necessarily love that one either. And then UCLA at 5.5. I think it's going to be a rough transition into the Big Ten for UCLA. I think the physicality, the talent, the money gap, all of the stuff is going to be huge hurdles for them to get over. And I think Deshaun Foster, is going to be a success over there. I just think it's going to take some time, and this is going to be probably the low point for the Bruins. Too low, I have Nebraska at 7.5, Wisconsin at 6.5. I think Nebraska is a team that could totally flip this conference on its head. If Dylan Raiola plays just good football, I think they're a 9-3 level team, maybe even 10-2 team. The defense is going to be top 10 in the country likely. They're going to be able to do some things that are just really remarkable. So I really like that team. I think they're probably going to get maybe even up to 9-10 wins this upcoming season. And then Wisconsin at 6.5. I just feel like Tyler Van Dyke is a perfect fit in this program. I don't have, too much evidence necessarily to support that. I just think a change of scenery for this kid. The run game, I think, is going to be much better than it was a year ago at Miami. I think things are just going to go really well for him at Wisconsin, if I'm being totally honest. I'm just making that bet right now. So I really like this Wisconsin team. I think they have more about them than you would think. And then the other ones I think are relatively on the money. There are a couple like Iowa and Michigan that might be a touch too low, if I'm being totally honest. And then Rutgers and Illinois might be a little bit too high. Frankly, Rutgers I'm actually okay with. I'm kind of in between on that one. Illinois I think might be just a touch too high. It's a really good group overall, and I think it's going to be a really hard-fought conference. Obviously, with no one have a win total under 4.5, it's going to be a hard-fought conference. There's no two ways about that. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Obviously, Ohio State and Oregon kind of setting the pace out there. But this is going to be a conference that is going to come down to that group in the middle. The USC, Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska, all those teams are likely going to decide this conference because one of those teams is going to trip up one of the big guys. I can almost promise you that. And that game is going to be one we look back on and say, that might have been the one that kind of did Oregon in, or did Ohio State in, or did Michigan in, whatever team it is. Some team is going to trip up on one of those guys, and it's going to be fascinating to watch, that's for sure. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a Cinderella watch for the Big Ten. We're going to break down two teams that I think definitely will have a lot to say about the Big Ten and could make some noise not only in the Big Ten, but maybe in the playoff if they get there. So I want to break down who those two teams are and why I think they have a lot to really gain this upcoming year right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into a little bit of the win totals for the Big Ten, broke down who I think is too high, who's too low, who's right on the money in that conference, and now let's get into some Cinderella teams from that conference. The Big Ten is very, very interesting this upcoming year. You have Ohio State, you have Oregon, you have Michigan, you have Penn State up at the top. We know about those teams. There's no two ways about that. Yesterday we did break down the SEC. You have A&M and OU were the teams that I highlighted. Frankly, I don't love my A&M pick because their win total is at least 8.5. I think that's not too much of a Cinderella. So I'm going to set a little bit of a moniker for myself, the same one that Tom Fornelli set when he was doing this. The win total has to be 7.5 or lower. That's just going to be the rule going forward. I feel like that's the right way to go about business. If that was the rule for the SEC, I likely would have gone Auburn in that place, but that's beside the point at this point. But let's get to the two teams I have for the Big Ten, and I think for me, it starts with Nebraska. I think this team is so fascinating. Matt Rule going into year two. In year two at Temple, he won 4 more games than he did in year one. In year two at Baylor, he won 6 more games than he did in year one. So if he follows that trend, he's winning 10 games this upcoming year. Now, I'm not necessarily saying he will, but this team is going to be good. They're going to have the ability to possibly do that. I think Dylan Raiola is obviously got the weight of the entire Cornhusker Nation on his shoulders. There's no two ways about that. This team is under a ton of pressure, and he's likely number one on that list. When you're the quarterback of a team that has been out of, favor for quite some time, when your dad's on the roster or when your dad's on the coaching staff, when he came to the school, when a lot of stuff is being put on you to be the savior of this program, it's going to be a lot of pressure, but he has plenty to work with. The wide receiver group is a really fun one over there. You have Jamal Banks coming over from Wake Forest. You have Isaiah Nair. You have guys like Malachi Coleman, Jalen Lloyd, 2 guys that definitely could have breakout seasons this upcoming year. I think it's a really, really fun group that absolutely is much better than what Nebraska has had even last year. There's Jamal Banks there. Will likely be the wide receiver 1 for this team. And then you have Gabe Ervin in the backfield. I think this run game is going to be solid. They're going to be able to move the ball. The offensive line returns 3 starters, also adds Micah Mazuka from Florida, who's an absolute big boy. He's going to be able to eat up a ton of space, definitely be a good run blocker, and help out this offensive line. So I think they're going to be able to get pushed against most of the defensive lines they're going to face in the conference. There are a couple that are going to be really hard to push off the ball, the Michigan, Oregon, Ohio States of the world. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a really solid offensive line, and that's obviously going to help with the run game and help with Dylan Raiola being who he can be, which I think is a really, really good player. But the defense is the comfort zone for this team. It's the comfort zone for all of the Nebraska fans out there. I'm sure they're going to be a top 15 team in the country when it comes to defense. Last year, I believe they were number 11 in the country, if I'm not mistaken, and I think they could take another step forward this upcoming year. Guys like MJ Sherman, Bly Hill, I think are going to be hugely important for this team. MJ Sherman, I think, has only been building up throughout his time at Nebraska since coming over from UGA, and I think he has the ability to totally break out this year. A very good edge rusher that has a ton in his bag, and I think he's going to be a really big-time player. And then Bly Hill on that back end, he was a big-time transfer they got, so definitely someone they can really rely on that back end. Definitely someone that can kind of keep a blanket on opposing offenses. So I really like this team. I think they have the ability to do some really, really remarkable things. And frankly, when you can score 20 to 24 points a game and win a lot of them, you're going to be really successful. So having guys like MJ Sherman, having Bly Hill, having tons of returning starters on this defense in general is going to be a huge help to this team, and will definitely add a layer to this team that people might not be ready for, frankly. It's a very, very fascinating team, and I think with Matt Rule at the helm, you know you're going to get good coaching. I think as long as Dylan Raiola comes along and is the player that a lot of people expect him to be, you're going to have a really fun season. Now, I think there could be some, up and down points with Dylan Raiola, and he could struggle a little bit, but when you have that defense behind you that's going to help him out, I think it's going to be hugely helpful for his success. So it's a fascinating team. I think everyone's kind of circling them in the back of their mind, but I think they're going to be really good, frankly, and I think they have the ability to not only make noise in this conference, but maybe even get to Indy if the cards fall right and they're able to play the right amount of the right football at the right time. So I think this is a really good team. I think they have the ability to play with pretty much anyone in the conference. But the other team that I want to highlight is a little bit more off the beaten path, but still a very good team in my mind, and that's Wisconsin. I think this team has the ability under year two, again, under Luke Fickell, a new coach coming in, like Matt Rule into the Big Ten a year ago. They're going to get, not a lot of talk. Let's just be totally honest. They're not necessarily the most interesting team in the Big Ten when it comes to this upcoming year. Everyone's going to talk about Oregon and USC and Washington coming in. They're going to talk about Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State up at the top. And Wisconsin just kind of play their game. And I think for everything for this team starts with Tyler Van Dyke. I think we all understand that. He's lost pretty much every single believer that he had when he was at Miami. I'm just not one of them. I'll be totally honest. I think this dude has the ability to get back to that sophomore season and play some really good football. And I think a change of scenery is hugely important. I think some of the staff changes, both head coach and OC-wise, did not help him out when he was at Miami. And I think he's definitely in a situation that feels a little bit more comfortable to him. I think this offense makes more sense to his skill set. I think he's definitely in a position where he can kind of just let it rip and play football again instead of worrying about, being the guy for Miami and being everything for that team. He can just go play football, and it helps that you have one of the most dangerous run games in the entire country. When you have Ches Malusi and Tawi Walker, I think it's one of the most underrated running back duos in the country, and they can do essentially anything you need for them. You have three guys returning on the front that started 13 games a year ago on the offensive line. You have Jake Renfro and Joe Bruner kind of stepping into bigger positions at the center and right guard positions, but as long as no injuries happen on this offensive line, they're going to be solid. Now, if you do have a couple of guys that go down, it doesn't sound like they're too confident in their depth over there in Madison, so definitely a little bit of worry there. You're going to have to kind of fight an uphill battle there and hope that everyone stays upright, because if they don't, this could be a little bit tough of a season. And then you get into the defense. It starts with Hunter Wohler. This guy is an absolute beast. He's one of the best safeties in the entire country this upcoming year, with a lot of good safeties in this country. When you talk about Malachi Starks, Caleb Downs, Xavier Watts over at Notre Dame. There's tons of really, really good players. Hunter is right there with all of them. He's really, really incredible. And then you bring in someone like Tackett Curtis from USC, who didn't get to play too much in the spring because he was recovering from an injury, but I think he's going to be a fantastic player for them. I think he's going to be huge in the middle of that defense for not only 2024, but multiple years to come down the road. And then you have Leon Lowry coming in, absolutely huge at linebacker, has been great throughout spring and definitely someone they love over there. And then you have John Pius as well coming in to kind of anchor the middle of that defense. I think it's going to be a really good group. It's not necessarily going to be that dominating group that totally shuts down every offense they face, but absolutely can be a group that can compete with every single offense that they're going to face, and definitely a group that absolutely can be big-time players. So I really like this team overall. I think one of the biggest things that people talk about with Wisconsin is the run game, is the aggression, but the pass game is going to need to take a little bit of a step up, and obviously that starts with Tyler Van Dyke, but also you have Will Paulding, who kind of came onto the scene a little bit last year as wide receiver one, will likely be that again this upcoming year. But you have Bryson Green, you have Vinny Anthony the second, that absolutely can make steps forward for this team and be big time players. So I think this team is really interesting. It doesn't necessarily have all the bells and whistles that a lot of the other teams do, but I think they're going to play really good football. I think Luke Fickell and his staff is going to put together really good game plans. They're not going to make it easy on a lot of teams, and definitely will be a very interesting group to watch. So there's still some other teams that I'm watching in the Big Ten. Iowa, USC are two other teams that I think are going to be really interesting. If Iowa can figure out that offense, if USC can figure out that defense, it's going to be fascinating to watch those two teams develop. And then, there's a ton of other teams that absolutely will have plenty to say, but those are my two picks for Cinderella Watch in the Big Ten. We'll do the Big 12 tomorrow, but we're going to take our final break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the top 10 domino players in the upcoming season. These are the players that not only will have effect in their team, but could have effect with the conference and college football and the playoff and everything in between. So I want to break down those players as I see it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Big Ten and some of the different Cinderellas in that conference. I went into Nebraska and Wisconsin myself, but definitely some other teams to watch out there. Iowa, USC, some other teams that are definitely very, very interesting. But let's get into a Top 10 Tuesday. And today we're going to do something a little bit different, kind of an interesting list. I got my biggest domino players in the country, and that might be a little bit confusing. Essentially what I mean is if these players hit, if these players play to their top potential, a lot of stuff happens around them. Not just, their team succeeding, but possibly winning the conference, possibly going to the playoff, possibly, saving their head coach, doing a lot of different things that can affect the entire college football landscape. So I wanted to break down these guys. Definitely a very interesting list to put together, but let's start with one of the guys that was one of the biggest transfers of this past class, and definitely someone that will have plenty to say about the ACC this upcoming year. Well, frankly, I'm starting at the wrong side. I shouldn't be starting at number 1. I'm going to start at number 10, and we're going to start with one of the biggest players from a year ago, Jalen Milroe. I think this is a very fascinating guy. He holds a ton of weight on his shoulders when you talk about the amount of doubters that are coming into this season around Bama and Kalen DeBoer in this new era after Saban. Jalen Milroe is likely going to be the guy that decides a lot of it. He's going to be the guy that, they point to when they say this team was a failure or this team was a success. He's going to be the reason, one way or the other. So he has a ton on his shoulders this upcoming year. I think if he's able to be consistent in the mid-range passing game and he's able to, make some plays with his legs and, be who he is, he's going to make it really hard on some defenses. And let's just say for a second that Alabama makes a run, wins the SEC again, and, goes to the playoff. The conversation is no longer, what is Alabama after Nick Saban, is how is Alabama still doing this? And are they around just forever, for eternity at this point? So it's a remarkable amount of pressure that he has on his shoulders, but if he hits, then a lot of things happen for that program and for college football overall. But let's move on, stay in the SEC here for a second. Let's talk about Nico Iamaleava. I think when you talk about this Tennessee team, it's been a very long time since they've been national title contender. Now, 2022 was a very fascinating year, and definitely a year that they would tell you if Hendon Hooker was healthy, they were winning the national title. I'm not as big on that as some other people, but I do think if they were able to repeat 2022 with quarterback health this time around, this is a very interesting team, and it would totally change the way that the Big Ten, or the SEC looks going forward, where it's no longer talking about Alabama or even talking about maybe Texas going into the future of the SEC. It's Tennessee right up there with Georgia and right up there maybe with Texas at the end of the day, but there's definitely a ton on this kid's shoulders, and if he hits, this team becomes, turns from a team that some high-level SEC teams aren't too worried about to a team that is going to compete for national titles and do things that they've been waiting quite some time in Knoxville for them to do. But let's move on to Cade Klubnik. This one has more to do with the outside world than pretty much any of the others. Clemson is under as much pressure as you could possibly imagine. There are so many things going into this year where Clemson didn't go into the portal. They didn't do certain things that people have continually told them they have to do. If Cade Klubnik plays well, they're going to be a really good team. And they're going to be a team that, bucks all those stereotypes and makes everyone know that we are doing it the right way. And the way that we do it is the winning way and that type of thing. So if Cade Klubnik can take a next step, if Garrett Riley and him can be in lockstep moving forward, I think this is going to be a really good Clemson team. It could be another elite Clemson team that makes the playoff and maybe makes a run in the national title, and then we're going to have a really different conversation about Clemson than we're having right now. So that'll be a fascinating player to watch. If he can make things happen for that Clemson offense, it could be a really interesting conversation a year from now. I'll just put it that way. And then I got Cam Rising at 7. I think when you look at the Big 12 right now, even if you take away the quarterback, Utah is the best team. It feels like bar none, that's no question. If you add a healthy Cam Rising that can really play some football, they're going to be the runaway team in this conference. I'll be totally honest. I like Kansas State. I think there's some teams right there that could give them a run for their money, but if Cam Rising is playing his football, I see them winning the conference, and I see them maybe even going undefeated on the road to doing that. So I think they're going to be a really good team. I think when I look at the Big 12 going forward, there are a couple of teams that I'm circling that could be the dominating forces in this conference, but a lot of it comes down to this year. Whoever wins this year is going to be in the driver's seat for that position, and I think Cam Rising will have plenty to say about what happens with Utah going forward. So very fascinating team, very fascinating person for this upcoming season, definitely someone that can affect the entirety of the Big 12 and the way that people see Utah within the Big 12 going forward. But also, Avery Johnson is right above him. I think this kid can do some things that are totally unheard of. I think he's something I kind of call a lightning rod player. I think anytime he steps on the field, he ignites his team. He ignites the game. He ignites an entire season when he steps on the field because he's that electric. He can do things that not a lot of people in this country can do. Him and Dylan Edwards is going to be one of the best duos, one of the most interesting duos in the entire country. And if they, make a playoff run, win the Big 12, do some things that they definitely want to do this upcoming season, it could be a TCU type or Washington type run where you just make a couple of those plays that other people can't make, and Avery Johnson's going to be a huge reason for that. So I think he's a fascinating player. He's one of those guys that I think when you look at Kansas State, if you take him out of the equation, they're likely not necessarily a playoff team. You add him to the equation, I think they could make a run of the championship. So there's a ton to like about this team. Definitely a team that absolutely can make a run, but Avery Johnson's going to be the reason if they absolutely do. So that'll be really interesting to watch. But let's move into the top 5 here. And let's start with Alex Orji. I think this guy has a ton on his shoulders, a ton going into the season for Michigan, where you lost so many people. You lost Jim Harbaugh. You lost, I think, 18 guys to the NFL. So many guys walked out of that program, and the one that everyone's focusing on, obviously, is J.J. McCarthy. If Alex Orji can somehow run this offense as efficiently, or at least towards the same level that J.J. McCarthy ran it, this team is going to be dangerous. They're going to have an ability to, do some things in the run game that they haven't done in the past with Alex Orji and Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullings. They're going to have the ability to play really good defense. There's no two ways about that. It's going to be a really dominating defense, and if Alex Orji hits, and if Michigan goes to the playoff and they beat Ohio State for a fourth year in a row, and they do some of the things that most people are assuming they just won't do again, what conversation are we having around Michigan? Are they the team that, are they the team that moves into the upper echelon of the sport? Are they with Georgia? Are they with, Bama and maybe Texas and some of if they beat Texas, there's a different conversation. So this is a very fascinating player, definitely one that adds a different dynamic to this offense. So definitely could be a big time player for them and could turn college football on its head, if I'm being totally honest. And then I have Jackson Dart at 4. I think you look at this Ole Miss team, everyone's watching them. There's so much going into this season. There's tons of portal guys, tons of guys that absolutely are going to have huge effects. And I think Jackson Dart, if he takes that next step forward, this team is going to be incredible. He's going to have a Heisman-level season. They're going to be able to win pretty much every game that they play, win the SEC, go to the playoff, do all of the things that they want to do. But it all falls on this kid's shoulders. And if he is able to pull all this off, if he's able to take that step forward and maybe have a Heisman-level season, Ole Miss is going to be a player in the SEC for quite some time. Lane Kiffin just needs that, rocket booster. He just needs the thing that kickstarts him into making Ole Miss not only a player in the 9-10 win category, but competing for SEC titles. But you need that igniter switch, and Jackson Dart is absolutely that guy that can make that happen this upcoming year. So a fascinating player. But now, Drew Aller at 3, I think, is a very obvious one. When you talk about what Penn State can be, it all comes down to this kid. Can he take that step forward? We talked about it yesterday. I frankly think he will take a step forward. It depends how big that is. That'll depend how far they can go in this upcoming year. But I think he has tons of talent. I think he can do incredible things at the quarterback position. And he brings something to Penn State that they haven't had in a long time, which is elite quarterback talent. And the players around him are a little bit of a worry, but I think they're going to have a great run game. I think they're going to be successful. I think they're going to have a good pass blocking. So give this kid time, and he's going to cook. I almost promise you that. And then him and Andy Kotelnicki getting on the same page is going to be huge for this team. But if all of that happens, if Drew Aller takes a leap forward, this is a team that can win the conference and, make Ohio State and Michigan fans very mad in the process and kind of turn this conference on its head where it feels like everyone's circling either Ohio State or Oregon to win this conference and kind of forgetting that Penn State has a ton of really good things in place. But if Drew Aller hits and he hits the way that I'm personally expecting him to hit, they're going to win this conference, and they're going to do some things that people just don't expect them to do. Now, all of that is rendered mute if this next guy, Will Howard, hits, because the reality is he might be the single most important player in the country this upcoming year. If he hits and plays really good football this upcoming year, if it plays A-plus football, the 2022 Will Howard that led Kansas State to a Big 12 title, it's over. Ohio State is your national champion, period. I feel very confident in that. This team is incredibly talented, incredibly deep, has so many guys on defense. The wide receiver group is a wide receiver group at Ohio State. It's going to be absolutely elite. Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson right next to him. It's just ridiculous what this team can do. And this O-line's got to be a little bit better. It likely will be. Chip Kelly coming in is huge for him. My point in all of this, Will Howard could ruin college football in 2024. He could totally bury the rest of the entire sport because of how good this team is. And now it won't necessarily matter too much until that national championship game where maybe they face off against a Georgia who might be doing the exact same thing in the SEC. But Will Howard could totally bury everyone else in this conference, everyone else maybe in the sport, if he can play good football, because everything else on this team is outright elite. It's insane how good this team is, but if you just flip that last switch that is Will Howard in that quarterback position, things get really interesting. But number one on my list, and frankly, I might have flipped these two, Will Howard and this next guy, But Cam Ward, I have at number 1. I might have had him at number 2 if I were to do it right now, if I'll be totally honest. But this guy is very fascinating. The Miami Hurricanes have been dormant for a little bit of time here. It hasn't necessarily been too long since they've been at the national and the forefront of the national conversation. And I promise you, Cam Ward might just get him there. He is someone that absolutely can play really high-level football, and if he is who Hurricane fans want him to be and who they think he is, they can win a title. There's no doubt in my mind. He has plenty to work with on the outside with Xavier Restrepo, Jacoby George, Houston transfer Sam Brown coming in at wide receiver, Elijah Lofton's a standout freshman tight end, so he has plenty to work with. This team can be outright scary, and I promise, if Miami comes back to the forefront of the sport, we're having a very interesting conversation, because Mario Cristobal, with a lot of backing, with a lot of, that type of talent behind him, and this igniter season that we were talking about with Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin, things would get really interesting down in South Florida. And I think Cam Ward has a super high ceiling, maybe even higher than some people might think. And if he hits, Miami is all the way back, and they can, compete for national titles and do some of the things that I think some people in the ACC and beyond are a little bit scared for Miami to do. I'll be totally honest with you. So it's going to be fascinating to watch these teams unfold, these players unfold, because they have a lot of power in their hands. If they play really good football, a lot of things can go right for them. If they play really bad football, a lot of things are going to happen in the wrong direction. So other guys, Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, Dylan Gabriel, DJ, and Kyron Drones, all are going to have big-time effects on the season. But it was definitely those 10 players I felt like kind of separated themselves from the pack, at least in my opinion. Definitely let me know if you have any players that I missed on this list, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing awesome work across every single sport you could think of. So no worries, we have you totally covered over here at GSMC Sports. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.